1830, but instead they came in a train drawn by one of the great late Victorian locomotives, Hardwick. And they sat in sumptuous coaches, carriages which not so long ago belonged to the royal train. Sir Peter Parker, the chairman of British Rail, headed the official party with his wife, followed by Norman Fowler, the Minister of Transport, here to perform the opening ceremony with his wife, and then all the other guests alighted, and everyone was agog.
Chairman, I'm delighted to be associated with the celebrations today and to be able to declare open this 150th anniversary of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. When the cavalcade comes past, government ministers and MPs are advised very much to keep off the track on this occasion.
A reference to the death of poor William Huskisson in 1830.
But Sir Peter, I would like now to open this cavalcade in the traditional way that I gather railways have always been opened, and that's with a bell which has got a history which I think the commentator will tell you about at a short space of time. But with this bell, I will now open this cavalcade.
The practice of opening a railway with a bell is in fact a Scottish custom, but it so happens that the present general manager of London Midland region used to work in Scotland, and when he left they gave him that bell as a present. And to be fair, we also have the band of the Irish Guards. Well, with the official ceremony over, the crowd settled down to enjoy the great cavalcade, even in spite of the absence of Rocket. Now, I want to show you the great cavalcade on Monday, and Rocket too, I hope, because, you see, all is not over for Rocket, nor indeed was this official opening the start. We have to go back along the track to the colliery siding, where this great railway cavalcade was assembled, and everybody did a great deal of work. Rocket 150 is a cavalcade to celebrate two great events in railway history: the Rainhill trials of 1829 and the opening of the Liverpool-Manchester Railway in 1830. And the purpose of the trials was to find the locomotive engine best suited to pull the trains on the new Liverpool-Manchester Railway, and so provide what we would now call the first regular passenger intercity rail service in the world. Now, the trials was a competition. The prize was £500, which wasn't a fortune even in those days. But whoever won knew that he stood to get the contract for all the locomotives for the railway. And, of course, the locomotive won is the most famous locomotive in the world, Robert Stephenson's Rocket. And this is it. Or rather, this is a replica of it. But you must not imagine that this means that this was easily produced out of a mould. This was very difficult to construct, and judging by the feverish activity on it today, is still as capricious and as very much a one-off creation as the original Rocket. Now, there are those who wish that Rocket had never won those trials, but I believe that it was right that it did, because Rocket was the locomotive which was able to be developed most rapidly and most extensively. And indeed, it provided really the foundation of steam locomotives for the next 100 years. But of course, it had rivals. To be precise, two rivals, only one of which seriously worried the Stephensons, Robert and George, and that was this locomotive, Sans Pareil, and this too, incidentally, is a replica and very beautiful. Now, this locomotive had been built by a man called Timothy Hackworth. And Hackworth had worked for the Stephensons as an engineer and then got a job as locomotive superintendent on the Stockton and Darlington Railway. So he had a full-time job, he had 8 kids to feed and educate, but he still found time during the evenings to put together this magnificent locomotive. The trouble was he had to subcontract bits of work. He had to put things out to have them made for him, some of it to the Stephensons. And, of course, when he failed in the trial, there were those afterwards who said there'd been a bit of sabotage. I don't believe a word of that myself. I think that in the end, he produced a locomotive which was slightly too heavy for the job, which proved to have all sorts of problems, and which, indeed, had it won, would have pointed the whole development of locomotives in the wrong direction, because, really, this was the last of its kind, whereas the Rocket was the first of its kind. Still, there was a third contender who was never really in with a chance. The T-Urn was the name that they gave it in the Stephenson camp, and you can see why. But its real name was Novelty. It had been built by 2 blokes in London called Braithwaite and Ericsson. Had only heard about the Rainhill trials a few weeks before, and in fact they only had 7 weeks in which to make it. They had no experience of railways. They were used to building road engines, little things like fire engines. But they built it and they brought it to Rainhill, and the public loved it. The public thought it was very pretty, and this is the one that they wanted to win, because I really think they thought of the Stephensons as the big bad wolves. However, Novelty wasn't up to the job. Perhaps it was too underpowered. It certainly wasn't by any means reliable enough. And I'm sad to report that this Replica too has its problems. It too is underpowered and lightly sprung, and has even toppled off the track. And I fear that it may need a lift to Rainhill. But whether they get to Rainhill under their own steam or whether they require assistance, the 3 replicas, Novelty, Sans Pareil and Rocket, will only be the beginning of a great cavalcade of trains. A cavalcade now being assembled here at Bold Colliery, and which represents the whole history of British Railways from the very beginning right through into the future, because even the APT is here, not yet in service, and sadly it too will need assistance to get to Rainhill because it's electric and the line here is not electrified. But all the work is being done on the great steam locomotives, all being spruced up, decorated, getting up ahead of steam and being photographed endlessly. I'd like to show you 1 or 2 of the ones you remember most. Do you remember Princess Elizabeth? One of the great interwar express trains, long before we'd heard of intercity travel. And Sir Nigel Gresley, named, of course, after its designer, Sir Nigel Gresley, the famous designer of East Coast trains, who also designed Mallard, very much the same kind of locomotive, which holds the world steam record. Gresley's great rival was Sir William Stanier, who designed the trains that went up the West Coast. And much, much older, Hardwick, one of the great steam locomotives of the end of the last century, which took part in the races right up to the north, when they used to race to see who could get first to Aberdeen. But I think the one that has attracted most attention today is the little working engine Robert. It works here at Bold Colliery every day of its life, and it looks as if it stepped straight off the pages of a children's book. A big steam locomotive, something like a Flying Scotsman, costs a great deal of money to operate and to maintain. And in any case, if you own one, what do you do with it? Well, George Hinchcliffe is chairman of SLOA, to be faster, the Steam Locomotive Operators Association. Do you regard this as a museum piece, or as a circus animal, or as what?
No, I regard it as a piece of plant to do a piece of work to convey people from point A to point B and give them a very great deal of pleasure in doing so.
But it's more entertainment than transport.
Oh, of course, yes.
Are you allowed to run it on ordinary lines, or are you in danger of getting in the way of British Railways in their everyday operations?
We're allowed to run it on British Railways tracks, but we are confined to the secondary routes. We can't compete with the intercity trains, for instance, because we're limited to 60 miles an hour.
So if you have Flying Scotsman or any other big locomotive, what do you do with it, to earn enough money?
It pays its own way so far as operating is concerned. We have supporters organisations, quite a large number of volunteers. We do filming work. We put it on public display whenever possible. And the whole lot put together normally makes a little bit of profit at the end of the year.
But even if you've got the income, do the skills exist to keep the thing running?
Yes, they do, because skills are handed down from person to person. And the older hands, who are now slowly, and in some cases rapidly, disappearing from British Rail, are passing their skills on to the younger ones. And so we've really got younger people of the age of perhaps 20, 25, who are learning skills which died out 10 and 15 years ago.
And when you say young people, these are not just enthusiasts. I mean, there is a career, is there still, in steam locomotion?
Very much so, because as you were saying earlier, we are in entertainment business, and the various preserved railways and museum centres are now recruiting people who are making it their lifelong career of keeping these engines in working order.
Because there are those who would hope that steam locomotion might yet come back as a real business in the sense of an everyday one. Clearly it won't. Do you think as the days grow further apart, it'll become more and more attractive as an entertainment?
Oh, I'm sure it will, yes.
I mean, what do the children think of it, for instance, who come and see it?
Well, most of them think it's marvellous. The younger ones have seen the pictures of these marvellous machines in picture books and so on, and then they come and see them in the flesh. But occasionally one gets some marvellous remarks from children, like the little girl who said, "Oh, isn't it wonderful, Mummy, but what does it do?"
And did you explain to her what it did?
I tried to do my best to explain to her.
And they see it like a circus, do they not? So in a sense, in the end, the circus animal is perhaps the best description of it.
I think so. It's the best way of explaining it to someone who doesn't really understand the ins and outs.
George Hincliffe, thank you very much. So, some of the steam locomotives being prepared here for the Cavalcade are privately owned, but many have come from the National Railway Museum at York. Among them, this one, Evening Star, the last steam locomotive to be made for British Rail. It was built at Swindon in 1960, and it ran for only 5 years and has been preserved for 15 years. So already it's had 3 times its life as a relic. And on the footplate is the Chief Mechanical Engineer of the National Railway Museum, John Bellwood, with a lovely fire. I imagine that this one is much easier to maintain, of course. It's practically new than the old Victorian ones.
Yes, they didn't take into consideration that the locomotive should look elegant, as was a major consideration with the Victorian locomotive engineers. In this case, it was ease of maintenance was of paramount importance, and the items requiring major attention were made as accessible as possible.
Practically put them on the outside where the Victorians covered them like piano legs.
Oh yes, they were felt to be indecent in Victorian parts were the mechanisms of the
When you're
locomotive.
maintaining the very old ones, so what's the most difficult thing? I mean, the mechanical thing, or making it match, getting paint back, making it look as it looked in its early days?
It's a combination. One of the major problems is when we maintain an old locomotive in running condition, because we have to compromise to meet present-day safety regulations and requirements, which are much more stringent than they were 50 or 100 years ago.
So even at the museum at York, all the time you're thinking of getting them out and using them?
Yes, not every one of them, but the idea is to always have a representative selection of locomotives, usually unique ones.
Yeah.
We don't like to duplicate locomotives of types that, say, the private preservation movement are running on their lines. But we have, of course, many unique locomotives in the national collection, and those are the ones which we concentrate on.
Well, I've always wanted to know how you drive one, and now seems to be the opportunity. Is the steam up, if that's the right expression?
Yes, the pressure gauge there shows that we've got about 100 pounds of steam, which is enough just to move the locomotive on its own. But when we would be working a train, we'd like in excess of 200 pounds per square inch pressure.
Good, so what do we do?
Well, there are 3 major controls. There's the regulator here, and this controls the flow of steam from the boiler into the cylinders to move the pistons to turn the wheels.
Yes.
There's the reversing gear here, which determines whether the locomotive goes forward or backwards, but also allows you to use the steam expansively. And that means that it can be used much more economically, use much less coal, much less water, which gives a longer range of operation of the locomotive. And then, of course, the paramount importance, having started the thing, you've got to stop it, so you've got the brake. The locomotive itself has got a steam brake, which is operated by this, but also to enable it to work vacuum-braked vehicles, that's carriages or wagons, it has a vacuum brake. And when it's on one of those trains, by operating the vacuum brake handle here, you proportionally apply the steam brake on the locomotive.
Do you think George Stephenson would have understood all that?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I think George Stephenson was pioneering so much that this would be child's play to him, was he living today.
And is it true that the firemen used to cook their breakfast on a shovel?
Yes, I'm told it is. I've never actually seen it done, but I'm assured by many driver friends of mine that it was a regular feature.
You know, I think I'll have a go at that, but John, thank you very much indeed. Apparently, to make his breakfast, the fireman used to clean his shovel with a slacker pipe, which sort of wastes steam. That made it hot, melted his fat on that, and then popped on his bacon and eggs and his sausage. Then all he had to do, you see, was open the fire door, stick it in and cook it. And on a good roaring fire, I mean, it was in and out in seconds, and no doubt straight down his mouth. I'm not sure that I'll eat it, though. I don't really think I fancy the taste of coal dust. It's going beautifully. Anyway, it's high time we moved away from firemen and locomotives to what they pulled, to the rolling stock. And I have with me another member of the National Railway Museum, the Education Officer, David Jenkins.
Well, I'm now standing inside the kitchen of one of the oldest preserved dining cars in Britain. It was built in the year 1900 by the London and North Western Railway, right at the height of the late Victorian, early Edwardian era of railways. It's not a very big kitchen, but it could cook a prodigious amount of food. Behind me here is a 12-ring stove, so you could have at least a dozen or more pans going strongly on here, and to my right here there are two huge ovens, each of which could hold at least a 30-pound turkey. This was because this kitchen had to supply food for probably 50 people at a sitting and 2 sittings at a time. And when the food was cooked, it was brought to the door of the kitchen, handed to the waiter, who then had to negotiate his way along a rather narrow corridor, which we're now going down. There was a butler's pantry on the right, and then, of course, he would come out into the main dining saloon, which is a good deal more elegant place than the kitchen itself. And when you sat down, there was a prodigious amount of room. For this was the elegance of a first-class dining carriage of 80 years ago, one simply surrounded by the opulence of the period. Beautiful moquette, upholstery, plenty of room to shuffle around if you're a little on the portly side, as I am. Gorgeous inlaid mosaic and marquetry work in the woodwork. And even the tableware is worth a second look. How about this for a coffee pot, for instance, after you've had your meal? Even the crockery itself is gold-banded and marked with the actual device of the railway on which it ran. This one is, in fact, the London and North Western Railway. And, of course, the Liverpool and Manchester itself became part of the London and North Western Railway. Upon my right, we have wine bottle holders. Not just ordinary bits of metal or anything like that, but even these, too, are inlaid with woodwork. In fact, this dining car was so good that when it was built in 1900, before it was put into service, the railway sent it to Paris on exhibition, where it won a Grand Prix. And it wasn't long after it came back to Britain that it was given a very different utilisation altogether. In fact, it was taken out of regular service and put to use in the British Royal train. And if we move along to the other part of the vehicle, we can see exactly the alterations that were made. Well, originally, this saloon, like the one next door, was arranged with fixed seating, but as you can see, it's very different now. The reason is that in 1901, when King Edward VII came to the throne, the railways built him a new royal train. Now, his mother, Queen Victoria, didn't like eating on the railway trains at all, but King Edward was a very different monarch to Queen Victoria, and it wasn't long before he wanted dining facilities on his royal train. And so, at a date which is not totally certain, this vehicle was altered from the arrangement we've seen to this open saloon with its individual dining chairs. Nothing much was changed in terms of decor, except for the insertion of new woodwork where the fixed seating was removed, and the new chairs were made specially for the occasion. The table could be arranged for any number of people from 2 or 3 up to 8, and we've got it laid out for 6, with the places staggered so that the customers had a little bit more room to partake of their meal. Well, when we sit down at this particular table, we discover that the silverware is much as we'd expect. But the crockery is a bit different, because it's a special blue-banded variety that was only used on the royal trains, and as far as I know, this particular pattern is still in use on the current royal train service. Now, as I said, the number of people could dine in this vehicle varied from 3 or 4 to 8, but we've been told that when the Queen was travelling, and this vehicle was used by the present Queen as recently as 1956, she always occupied the chair diagonally opposite on my left. And the vehicle itself didn't come into the museum collection until not much more than 20 years ago. So it's had a long and honourable life. For many years it was retired and just on public view, But last year we took the opportunity to thoroughly overhaul it and put it into full running order again. And as recently as last September, this old dining car, 79 years old, helped to commemorate the centenary of railway catering by travelling 2,500 miles round Britain with people sitting at these very seats eating meals. In the early days of mechanised railway travel, the railways were anxious to woo their customers from the patrons of the old road carriages or stagecoaches. And it's not really too surprising that their very earliest attempts at building a passenger railway carriage should follow the stagecoach idiom. They even painted them in the same colours and gave them some of the names of the old stagecoaches. This one's called Traveller. One particular difference that's worth noting, though, is that instead of just one section of enclosed area with two facing seats and a door, the railways realised they could pull rather heavier loads because they'd got smoother wheels and smoother rails. So they grafted three sections together. We call them compartments in our present day and age. And they put the three sets of carriage bodies onto one set of wheels and then attached them to each other to make a train as long or as short as they wanted. But there was another problem too. In the days of the stagecoach, if you couldn't afford to ride inside in something like this, then you rode on the roof of the stagecoach, or you walked. Well, it was highly dangerous to allow passengers to ride on the roof of a stagecoach. So if you couldn't afford to get inside one, you had to ride on something rather more primitive. And the Liverpool and Manchester Railway was no exception in this either, because these were first-class carriages for the more expensive customers, but beyond me, down at the end of the line, were the second and third-class carriages. Nothing much more than open boxes in which you stood up to have your journey. You got wet, but you didn't get quite as wet for quite as long as if you'd been riding on the stagecoach. And occasionally the railway might even drill a few holes in the floor to let the rain out.
The oldest locomotive in the Cavalcade is Lion. Now, you might recognise it as the Titfield Thunderbolt. And when I say oldest, I mean because it's the real thing. It's not a replica. This one was actually built in 1838 for the Liverpool-Manchester Railway. But of course it has to be driven. Driven in the Cavalcade like all the other locomotives and driven by regular crew of British Rail. And I have with me the fireman and the driver are going to do it. Tony Taylor's the fireman, Albert Ramsdale is the driver. I bet you didn't learn on something like this.
No, we actually started on steam engines in the early days. 1935, I started on the railway.
Now, is this simpler to drive than the ones you learned on, or more difficult, or...?
It's simpler for the simple reason there's less controls, and it's easier.
So you started and you stop it and you can't do much else?
Well, that's it, yes. And
Now,
only backwards and forwards.
Yeah. Now, when you're firing it, I mean, is it more sensitive than firing a more recent steam train?
Well, steam's easily gained, and it's also easily lost.
Do you have troubles with it?
You haven't much to play with. There's only 50 pounds boiler pressure.
So you're a
have
bit,
much to play with.
I mean, that's a strange comparison, but a bit like a helicopter pilot. I mean, you have your eyes on the gauge all the time.
Well, quite a bit of it, yes.
Do you get a sense of excitement when you drive it, or...?
Yes, there's that extra thrill of being concerned with it, really, and I like to pay tribute to the people that built it in the first place, and the people that is...
Well, it had a long spell, didn't it, this
Yes.
one, in the Mersey docks and harbours, a sort of static engine, but now it's back in use. Can we just have a look and see how you do use it? I mean, what are the simple controls?
This is the regulator, this is the steam supply.
Yeah.
And this is the reverser, which is the forward and backwards.
And you just hang your head around the side to
Just-
see where you're going?
Just to place it like that and put it in gear for forward and that way for backwards.
I don't know whether you talk about consumption per hundredweight or what, but how much fuel does it consume?
It doesn't consume a lot.
No?
No, but I wouldn't like to say how much per mile, but it doesn't consume a lot. No.
And how, in the end, how fast do you think you can get it?
Oh, we've had it 25 mile an hour on the speed test.
Have you?
For braking power, yes.
Well, thank you both very much indeed. I'm sure this is one people are really going to love in the Cavalcade.
Oh, yes, yes.
If the Great Cavalcade requires British Rail crews, no less does it require British Rail management. And David Ward is Passenger Marketing Manager of London Midland Region. Now, I can see it's going to be a great weekend, but why did British Rail decide to do it?
Well, firstly, we need to pay tribute to the past. This is, in fact, the start of railways. The opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway was the first intercity line. and I think most historians would accept that it was really the first milestone in the railway network as we know it today.
So in that sense, of course, Rainhill chose itself as the location to do it all, but had it any difficulties logistically?
Yes, it chose itself historically, but by great good fortune, it also chose itself logistically. We have the coal board power station and the power station here, and they very kindly opened their sidings and made us very hospitable with all our rolling stock and
in other words, if you hadn't had this colliery as an assembly point, it would have been very difficult to mount it.
It would, very difficult indeed. The other thing is that the actual Rainhill level, where Rocket won its £500 in 1829, also lent itself commercially, because there can be very, very little free viewing.
You've got to pay to get in unless you watch it on the box.
That's right.
But you must have spent a lot of money on it nonetheless.
Very nearly £1 million, and we are hoping to make a profit on it, and that is another reason why, in fact, we are doing it. The second reason is that we really want to be able to show off all our modern rolling stock. We shall have in the Cavalcade a modern freight locomotive and a modern electric locomotive, and of course we shall conclude it with the advanced passenger train, which takes us into the next 150 years.
So what do you hope the weekend will achieve, apart from entertaining a great bank holiday crowd?
Firstly, I think it will pay tribute to a tremendous past. Secondly, I think it's a very good thing to do from the point of view of staff morale, because it does provide a variety in life. And thirdly, I think it will show to the public generally what a great future the railways have got, and what some of the great rolling stock which we are now putting onto our modern trains.
So in other words, the whole thing is a marvellous publicity enterprise for British Rail.
That's correct, yes.
Good, excellent. Well now, as I see, it's about to be mounted. It's called Rocket 150. 3 days. Today, tomorrow and Monday, the public will see this great cavalcade. And on Monday afternoon at 10 to 5, in an hour-long programme, we'll show you the whole cavalcade. It's a programme that no railway lover can afford to miss, so I hope you'll watch. Meanwhile, let you and I go and play trains. All this weekend, people have been coming here to Rainhill for a 3-day event called Rocket 150, the Great Railway Cavalcade. The cavalcade is to commemorate 2 great events in railway history: the locomotive trials, which were held on this very spot here at Rainhill in 1829, and the opening a year later of this, the Liverpool-Manchester Railway. Now, the original trials were fraught with mechanical mishap, and I think it's an indication of the authenticity of what's happening this weekend that we've had mishaps too. And you may know that Rocket failed to run under its own steam on the first day. Indeed, it tumbled off the track 3 times, but fingers crossed. The cavalcade is unique. Never before has there been such a gathering of locomotives for an event like this, and we're unlikely to see it again in our lifetime. All the locomotives and carriages were brought together at Bold Colliery Sidings, which is about 4 miles up the track, and they've now made their way to Lee Green, which is about a mile back, and there they're lining up. Now, I say unique. It's true that in 1930 there was in Liverpool a centenary celebration of this great event in a pageant called Transport Through the Ages. I understand it began with a caveman dragging his wife along by her hair. Well, we're not going to have anything like that this weekend. What we are going to have is a great cavalcade of railway history, and we hope to show you it all. And to identify the locomotives and the coaches, I have with me from the National Railway Museum David Jenkinson as a kind of race reader. You must be delighted, actually, to get all the stuff out of the museum spilling onto the track.
Yes, it's a marvellous opportunity because our terms of reference suggest that we should run a live museum rather than a dead one, and what could be more live than this?
What do you think this weekend will achieve, though, apart from entertaining a great many people?
Oh, I certainly do that. It's a lot of fun, actually, but I think it reminds people that we ran a very complex transport system that we gave to the world, and that maybe the youngsters, particularly, will realise that We couldn't manage without motor cars once, you know.
That's true. Well, now, this weekend, we've had something like, I suppose, 150,000 people have come here. And there haven't been as many people at Rainhill since 1829, because, of course, this isn't normally a public location. In fact, if you hung around the railway line for too long here on a normal day, I imagine somebody would come and warn you off. But there's a great bank holiday atmosphere, and as with all great events at bank holidays, there are all the fun fair and the sideshows and things for the children and those things that loop the loop and the lot. And what's interesting is, of course, because no one's been here before, everyone's arrived with their own sort of sense of achievement. It was quite difficult even to find the site, threading your way through a housing estate, and then coming somewhere where no one had been, so there was no crowd that you could follow. Everyone had to find out for themselves where the things were and make their own way to the stands, and I think that has added to the enjoyment and the excitement that people have had. And I might add that some people have come a very long way.
Yes, we came from Germany, and my friends, they came from Austria, and we came over to see the Rocket 150, and we wanted to see the Cavalcade today, and we are very fond of steam engines.
Well, I'm from Brussels, but I'm very interested in railways because my father, my grandfather, and the father of my grandfather were working in the Belgian railways. Thus, I'm expecting to see the exhibition and also the steam cavalcade this afternoon.
We're from Washington State. That's where the volcano is. And generally having a great time. Wish the weather would clear up a little bit, though.
We are also both very avid railroad enthusiasts.
Yes.
We are both members of Railroad Historical Society in the United States in Washington, and this is why we're interested in the British and European railroading is also what we're interested in, so that this is a very important event for us.
Among the thousands of people arriving at Rainhill is practically every railway enthusiast, not just in the country, but in the world. But there's none with a longer list of credentials than O.S. Knock, author of no fewer than 106 books about the railways and still writing. Now, is today anything more than a great sort of feast of nostalgia for the enthusiast?
Oh, yes, it's very much more. It's a demonstration today of the faith in the future of the railways. It's a wonderful example of how we're not only blending the nostalgia of the past, the pageant of history, with the future trends which we shall see at the end of the pageant today.
So you're not one of those who's locked in the belief that when the steam locomotive went, the great age was over?
Oh, good gracious, no. No, I'm a great believer in railways and as they are today and as they're developing, and I think they've got a tremendous future.
I mean, do you think we're on the brink of a new age for railways?
I do. We most definitely are. We're going for very much higher speeds, much higher, and not only a few trains like the old Silver Jubilee, the old Coronation and such like, one train in the day making high speeds, but all trains on the line running at high speed.
So it isn't really a challenge between what locomotives, it's really a whole new system of railways.
It's a whole new philosophy of operation, and one that in Great Britain is being developed more than anywhere else in the world, namely a mixed railway. We're running our high-speed trains on routes which still carry all kinds of other traffic as well. And it's a wonderful sort of scheme of operation to get them to fit them all in and run them all to time.
Nonetheless, you were, like everyone else here today, going to enjoy this sort of journey through the past. What are you most looking forward to seeing?
Oh, undoubtedly, the three Rainhill competitors running again. Oh, yes, that's going to be tremendous fun.
On the first day of this three-day event, only one of the three replicas succeeded in running under its own steam, and that was Sanspareil, designed by Timothy Hackworth, whose great-great-granddaughter, Jane Hackworth Young, is here and triumphant. That's one up for the family, isn't it?
It is indeed, yes.
Getting your own back after all these years.
I think so. I think that Timothy Hackworth was terribly unlucky in the original trials. Everything that could go wrong really went wrong. And afterwards, the locomotive did run very successfully. Stevenson, I think, was very, very lucky, and a lot was done to the Rocket after the Rainhill trials to really make it a first-class locomotive.
Well, on the argument of people, of course, always support the winner, it's always been said the right one won. Indeed, I've said that myself, but you would argue with that.
I think that both locomotives contributed tremendously towards the age of steam, the beginning of the steam locomotive, or the first ones anyway that were used on passenger railways, because Timothy Hackworth had in his sans-pareil the blast pipe, and Stephenson only put the blast pipe into his rocket after the trials. The multi-tubular boiler of the rocket was marvellous, but that actually was designed by Henry Booth.
Well, as a family, have you always been passionate about the history of the engine?
Yes, very much so. My father was an engineer, and I was an only child and brought up to know all about it. And I have 4 cousins here today, all descended from Hackworth, and they are all very, very interested. And we all believe he contributed enormously to steam locomotive.
Did you ever think you'd live to see the day when sans-pareil would run again at Rainhill?
No, I didn't. I certainly didn't. It's just the last 5 years have been absolutely magnificent. What with the opening of a museum to Timothy Hackworth, the building of the replica, and it's just going on and on and on. It's wonderful. Really wonderful.
And this time Rocket has redeemed itself, firmly on the track, under steam, under its own steam, and giving great delight to everyone here. And I might add that everyone aboard is dressed, apart from the guy with the camera, is dressed in the authentic costume of the time, because the BBC has taken great care to ensure that that should happen. But they haven't seen a sight like this at Rainhill since George Stephenson himself was driving Rocket. And a great reward for the people who not only built the replica, but have had a couple of terrible worrying days making sure that it would operate to delight the crowd. They had thought of pulling more than one coach, but I think prudence suggested it would be wise not to attempt too much. Rocket's great rival, Hackworth sans-pareil. I like this one because it's a bit like a sort of mechanical St. Bernard with its water barrel on the front. The reason being, of course, that the fireman is at one end of the locomotive and the driver at the other. Not doing quite so well, perhaps, as it did on the very first day of these mock trials, because it's having to have a little assistance to make its way. But still a magnificent sight, pulling its one coach. Now an example of mid-Victorian elegance, a reminder of how rapidly locomotives became things of beauty. This is a Midland spinner, but spinner's a nickname, isn't it, David, not a name?
Yes, it is. In fact, the name is described as having arisen from one of 2 possibilities. One, that they seem to spin along effortlessly with a large driving wheel with apparently nothing to make it turn at all. Of course, all the machinery is inside. The other was less complimentary. It suggested that it slipped its wheels when it was trying to pull a heavy load. But this is an elegant locomotive.
Did the big wheel remain in favour for a long time?
Well, it had 2 sessions. In the early days, they used single-driver locomotives. Then they went out of fashion. And then the sanding gear, which is the pipe below the wheel, enabled them to come back into favour when you could blow sand under the wheel.
There's also, of course, a very elegant Midland livery.
Yes, this was introduced in the 1880s by the man who designed this locomotive, Samuel Johnson, and it became the real trademark of the Midland Railway Company. And that colour scheme lasted until the 1960s, before it finally disappeared from the railways of Britain.
And this, of course, is one from your museum.
Well, it's one from our museum, but one that's been on loan to the Midland Railway Trust at Butterley. Several of the engines that we own in this display are not actually located at York, and this is one of them.
Whoever you lent it to has certainly kept it in good condition.
It's beautifully turned out, and I think those responsible can be very, very pleased with themselves.
Well, now we turn to a lovely little one. Hasn't got a name. I think it's always sad when locomotives have no names, but of course the enthusiasts, in fact, always know them by the numbers anyway. Even when they have a name, they tend to refer to them by number. This one, 752, I suppose a typical shunter.
Yes, from the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, so very much a local machine built by Bear Peacock in Manchester. So very, very strong local connections with this one. and a typical maid-of-all work, built in the 1880s and used throughout, as its name implies, the Lancashire and Yorkshire territory. I think I'm right in saying this one started off as a tender locomotive, but was later fitted with this saddle tank so that it didn't need to have its coal and water supply separate. And a tank locomotive is very useful because, as you can see, it's much more compact.
And now a very famous and beautiful locomotive, the Hardwick, which has already made its mark this weekend by carrying the official party to the opening. And I think it's still drawing the same beautiful coaches, isn't it?
Yes, I hope you don't mind me saying, but I think we at the museum are very proud of this particular collection of locomotive and carriages. The carriages are from the old Royal train. They're not the Royal saloons, they are some of the supporting vehicles, including the dining car. And Hardwick, of course, the very famous racing locomotive of the 1890s. And this is what the trains of the London and North Western Railway used to look like until 1923, when the railway became part of the London, Midland and Scottish group.
Yes, Hardwick was one that used to take part in those races up to Aberdeen, but by the West Coast route.
That's right. The carriages are in the dark red and white colour scheme of the London and North Western, but they're carrying London, Midland and Scottish badges because the running gear is rather more modern than the bodies, and that's why they've managed to survive so long.
Now, I think you did tell me that this one is still capable of about 70 miles an hour.
If it were allowed to do so, I'm quite sure of it, Brian, but 60 miles an hour is the normal limit for steam locomotives allowed to run on British road.
Today, of course, they're all going in 10 miles an hour so that everyone can have a good look.
Yes, indeed. But can you imagine the time when dozens of them looked like this, and every carriage you saw in Liverpool, Lime Street or Manchester would look like this?
Now, although much more modest a locomotive than Hardwick, this little one, I gather, was designed by the same man.
Yes, indeed. And you can probably see that it's painted in the same colour scheme and generally got similar visual lines. These are much more humdrum, if that's the right word to use, but my goodness me, they did some work in their time. They were called coal tanks, because they were derived from a rather similar engine that carried a separate tender called a coal engine. And they did goods workings, they pulled passenger trains, they were real maids of all work. And for a long, long period of time, this one survived well into the period beyond the Second World War.
Technically, is it interesting?
I think it's a very typical late Victorian, very rugged, very simple sort of locomotive. No frills and furbelows. This particular railway was known for its frugality, the London and North Western, and that's the way they built their engines.
Name either of distinguished soldiers or of battle.
Now, this is Maud, not named after the lady who was reluctant to come into the garden, but after the general. This is Maud with an E at the end, and in fact Scottish, David.
Yes, this is a Scottish pairing. In fact, you might almost call it a marriage of odd enemies, because the locomotive comes from the North British Railway, but the carriage from the Caledonian Railway, which was the great rival of the North British. It's rather nice to see them having buried their differences today. And they both come from Scotland.
And they don't belong to your museum?
No, they don't. Although I wouldn't say I wouldn't mind them if they did. But Maud is a typical British goods locomotive. 6 coupled wheels and a tender behind it. And they were used all over the country for routine freight haulage.
She looks almost too beautiful for a job like that. You'd expect her to pull passenger coaches.
I've no doubt from time to time engines like this did.
We describe them as Scottish, but they would journey south across the border in the course of their working lives.
Yes, indeed, and I think this particular one actually went overseas in the First World War, and those that went overseas, when they came back, were given names to commemorate events of that conflict, including this one.
Hence Maud.
Hence Maud, yes.
The 1923 by Metro Camel is the full third class, and is also kept at 4 thirds. And the next one to come along here.
Now, a Midland compound. Compound always sounds like the name of a place where locomotives might gather, but in fact, what does it mean?
Well, it's a term used to denote the way in which the steam is used in the locomotive. Most steam locomotives in Britain are what we call simple. That is, the steam is used once in the cylinders and then exhausts through the chimney up to atmosphere. But in a compound locomotive, the steam passes through a high-pressure cylinder and then into a lower-pressure cylinder before it goes through the chimney. So it's called compound use of steam.
That's a very memorable number, isn't it, that one?
Yes, indeed. This was the very first Midland compound to be built in 1902, and it was rebuilt to this shape in 1914. And the carriage it's pulling, the dining car, was also built in 1914, so it's an exact contemporary pairing from the same railway.
Typical of the Midland, even the third-class dining car is very elegant.
Yes, the Midland was a great pioneer in third-class railway travel. It forced many of the other railways to follow suit or lose customers, and we're very pleased to have this particular pair in the museum at York, because they do represent all that was best about Edwardian and travel of that time.
The emancipation of the lower orders.
Indeed. And why not?
By that time, I suppose, there was no second class.
Not on many railways, but one or two railways kept on to a residual second class. Therefore, you had for a long time this somewhat curious situation that in Britain one had first and third class trains with no apparent second class. And it wasn't actually until 1956 that the second class finally disappeared, and we could logically then renumber them first and second as we have today.
And this locomotive, as I say, was built specifically for the Somerset Dorset line, and it's got a headboard on the front of the locomotive, the Pines Express. And those of you who are familiar either with
Another train from the south, from Somerset and Dorset, indeed, from the West Country. I think it might be a moment, David, to talk about the coming together of all the private railway lines into the Great Four. When was that, 1923?
Yes, it was 1923. This is in fact a very good engine to illustrate this point, because it was built for a joint line, the Somerset and Dorset, which was jointly owned between the Midland and the London and South Western. And in 1923, those two railways became part of the London, Midland and Scottish and the Southern. The Somerset and Dorset kept its identity for a few more years, but eventually its locomotives were absorbed by the London, Midland and Scottish. So there you see a Somerset and Dorset engine carrying the LMS lettering. It's very much in the same family as the Midland compound, except that the outside valve gear suggests that it's of a more modern type.
Many people, I imagine, will remember Pines Express.
Yes, indeed.
Now, this little goods engine is one of very many.
Yes, what we call the 060, that is the no small wheels at the front, 6 driving wheels and no carrying wheels at the back, must be the most typical of all British wheel arrangements during much of the steam period. And there were 772 of these built. They were designed by the Midland Railway, but after the Great Amalgamation of 1923, the LMS Railway continued to build them right until 1941, as a matter of fact.
Yes, they had these from 1911 to 1941,
yes,
with virtually very little change.
Very little change of any great note. They weren't particularly sophisticated, and many people would say that they were not the most efficient, but their sheer numbers and their fairly cheap to maintain nature, they probably earned their dividends over the years, yes.
They're also pretty reliable.
Oh yes, the Midland men liked them, and you could see them everywhere. Excursion trains, summer Saturday extras, holiday trips to Blackpool, almost anything that was needing pulling in the 20s and 30s, chances are one of these would be at the front of it.
Now here's an example of an even more numerous locomotive, but even more interesting, of course, is the train that it is pulling.
Well, yes, this is really what the railways were all about, Brian. The ubiquitous, made-of-all-work, mixed-traffic locomotive at the front. There were 842 of these built between 1934 and 1950. Perhaps the most successful mixed-traffic engine ever introduced onto the railways of Britain. And they pulled virtually every sort of train, from express passenger to local goods train. In fact, the only thing they couldn't put them in front of was the streamlined expresses of the 30s. And the vehicles behind it are a real mixture of the sort of trucks that were to be seen all over the country behind freight trains for a long, long period of time.
The days when we still called them goods trains.
Indeed, goods trains, although some railways, including the LMS, did tend to refer to them latterly as freight.
But even more important, look what it's carrying.
Yes, it's the leading vehicle is, of course, a brake van, but behind it we've got 2 well trolleys.
And sitting on it, Novelty.
Novelty, yes. I'm glad it's here. It's a very interesting way of displaying this locomotive, with its wheels chopped up, so that you can see them turning.
Of course, everyone had hoped this replica of Novelty, which was one of the 3 that took part in the trials here at Rainhill in 1829, would run under its own steam on the track. But I explained on Friday in the programme that we put out on Saturday that, in fact, it turned out to be underpowered and a little lightly sprung and kept toppling off the track. So rather than it not have its place in the cavalcade, they popped it on this van to bring it along. You can see exactly why they called it the T-urn. And this engine?
Yes, this is the narrow gauge locomotive Earl from the Welsh Pool and Llanfair Railway, which is on loan to us at the museum, and we're carrying it on a well trolley to allow it to clear the bridges. The idea is you depress the centre of the vehicle to allow a larger object to travel loaded on another vehicle. And behind that, of course, are a couple of cattle wagons, representing the time when livestock was carried by rail in very large quantities. You might like to know these are the very last 2 cattle trucks that ever carried livestock in this form on the railways of Britain. And the railways let us have them when they finished with them.
And now, with apologies to Welsh listeners, make sure I get it right, I think Drysluin Castle. This is the first of the Great Western locomotives that we've seen.
Yes, so far most of the parade has been of the London, Midland and Scottish and its constituent companies, but this is the famous Great Western, and what a magnificent turnout this particular combination of locomotive and carriages is. Great tribute to the private preservation movement, the locomotive from the Didcot Group and the carriages from the Severn Valley Railway.
What was the significance of the Castle class?
Well, it was one in a great line of Great Western locomotives, evolved from a period just after the turn of the century right through to the 20s and 30s. The castles date from 1923 and led in turn to the famous King type and via Williams Tannier to even more developments on the London, Midland and Scottish Railway. So they really are in the mainstream of British locomotive development, and it's great to see such a beautifully restored example here today.
There you are, Drysluin.
Lots of polished brass. This was, of course, the trademark of the Great Western, copper and brass, and this rich dark green colour. And the chocolate and cream of the carriages, of course, was another very familiar Great Western sight.
These carriages, though, are slightly younger than that locomotive.
Yes, I think both of them are. The leading one is a post-war vehicle, post-Second World War. The trailing vehicle is from the 30s, but they have been magnificently restored by the Severn Valley Railway, who own them. A credit to anyone, and I certainly wouldn't mind them in our museum at York if they came our way.
The Great Western, but not in this case from Didcot, but from the Great Western Severn Valley Railway Association.
Did they compete in decorations, all the various companies? And obviously they competed in basic livery, but in things like brasswork and...
I think it very much reflected the taste of the designer of the locomotive and perhaps to some extent the shape of the locomotive. On the Great Western you have the familiar copper-topped chimney and the polished brass of the safety valve, and the dark green colour lends itself to ornamentation with bright metalwork. Other railways chose a more elaborate paint scheme, but perhaps rather less polish. I think it was perhaps more a personal thing on the part of the designer or the individual railway.
And these were the most powerful 440 ever built in this country.
And now we move to Southern Railway and a locomotive called Cheltenham. I think the last of the 440s, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed. The 440, which is 4 carrying wheels at the front and 4 driving wheels behind it, was very common late Victorian Edwardian design. But this one appeared during the period after the 1923 amalgamations and was designed and built on the Southern Railway to take trains down to Bournemouth and places like that.
Now that is a very post-war green.
Yes, this is one from our collection in York that we've just finished restoring. We have several locomotives from the Southern Railway, so we've tried to put them in different colour schemes appropriate to the design, and we've chosen the immediate post-Second World War colour scheme for this one, and the green is called malachite green. It's a very bright shade indeed.
That was the final colour that Southern Region used,
yes,
wasn't it, before it became British Rail?
Yes, indeed, and the electric trains continue to carry this colour, although not with quite this amount of decoration, well into the British Railways period. We expect that this one will go into the, as it were, fleet of mainline approved steam locomotives for excursion work when she gets back to York.
Well, there cannot be a marshalling yard or a major siding anywhere in the country that hasn't seen one of these locomotives. They're almost the typical shunting. Yes?
Yes, you can't really get much more typical than this. It's a tank engine. Again, to repeat, this is because it carries its water in a tank at the side and the coal in a bunker. It doesn't have a separate tender. And they were used for shunting in marshalling yards, the forerunners of the modern diesel shunters. They called these jinties for some peculiar reason. I think that was an enthusiast nickname. And this little fella has been spending a lot of time over the last few days shunting some of the very carriages that are in this parade up at Bolt Colliery.
Now, I mentioned earlier, ladies and gentlemen,
well, if little Ginty'd been busy, so too has Robert, because Robert belongs to Bold Colliery, to the coal board there, which is where all the locomotives and coaches in this cavalcade have been assembled over these last few days. And Robert, in fact, is a working engineer, works every day, even though he's immaculate.
Yes, this reminds you that there were, of the time when many industrial plants had these little shunting tank engines in their warehouse yards and so on to handle the internal traffic, and they were often given gaily decorated colour schemes and elaborate names, some far more elaborate than Robert.
He must have been designed, what, during the Second World War?
Yes, it's an austerity design, I think one could say. It was designed for cheapness of construction, and there were many like this built during the Second World War, and quite a number of them preserved, as well as this one, of course, which is not only preserved, but in fact it's still doing its proper job.
And now we turn to one that everyone says is very ugly, which seems a bit unkind. I think the reason is that it has most of its works on the outside rather than the inside.
Yes, it's a little bit out of sequence historically with some of the ones we've been seeing, but this represents the sort of post-war attempt to try and cheapen the maintenance of locomotives by making it easier to get at all the various moving parts, and that meant bringing them to the outside.
Post which war?
The Second World War. And of course, this would really have shocked the Victorians to see all this moving machinery. They liked their locomotives nice and simple and neat, with everything discreetly hidden away below their skirts.
And this is what, a post-war parcel van?
Yes, a vehicle used for parcels or mail and things like that. Basically equivalent to a passenger carriage without any seats in it, so that you just fill it with luggage and so on, and it can travel at the normal passenger train speed. And you will see these in trains, perhaps a dozen at a time, running at very high speeds.
Now, would that one be preserved, or is that one just pulled out of stock?
No, I think this one is direct from the main fleet that British Rail own. It's in British Rail's own colours.
In case we've got anybody to be there, you might be interested in the engine's regular travel.
Yes, you see, the nudity of the engine, if that's what it is.
Yes,
it offends those who like the Victorian cover-up.
Yes, it was designed actually by the LMS Railway in 1947, but this particular one was built 2 or 3 years later, during the British Railways period, and was in fact built at the workshops of the old North Eastern Railway in Darlington. That whistle, incidentally, that hooting sound, was very characteristic of the London, Midland and Scottish. It came from the old Caledonian Railway in Scotland. It was known as the Caledonian Hooter, And nearly all the LMS engines of later days carried that low-pitched hooter rather than a high-pitched whistle.
And now we have another Great Western, one I think again belonging to the Severn Valley people. Characteristic 0601.
Yes, yet again, a characteristic goods engine. It has a tapered boiler, that is, it's smaller at the front than at the back, which is very much a Great Western trademark. It later became an LMS trademark as well. But it shows the simplicity of the external shape of the earlier type of locomotive, far less moving machinery visible on this one.
How old would that one be?
I'm not, to be honest, I'm not entirely certain how old that particular example is. But it's of a much earlier vintage than the black one, with all the rods and levers on the outside.
And now Gordon, named after a general, and very appropriately, because this is very much in every sense a wartime locomotive.
Yes, it was designed as a utility heavy freight type for military traffic, particularly during the Second World War. Many of these were built and most of them were shipped overseas. This particular one was kept in this country for training military personnel in driving and maintaining steam locomotives, because of course the military drove their own trains in overseas theatres, and naturally enough it's pulled up in true military style.
They blancoed the wheels by the look of it.
Yes, very nearly that.
And it's still really in its sort of military uniform, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. It's preserved on the Severn Valley, but in its military colour scheme. The LMR stands for Longmoor Military Railway.
And during the War Department was actually the owner of locomotives,
yes,
not the railway companies.
Yes, they were built by contractors and others, and frequently known as WD locomotives because of their association with the War Department.
I suppose we ought to say we've turned now to the Navy, because this one is named after Lord Nelson, but it's what, a 1920s Southern Railway?
Yes, it's somewhat contemporary with the Great Western Castle type, a little bit later, and it's a four-cylinder engine like the Great Western Castle. That is two cylinders on the outside, which you can see, and two more tucked away under the smoke box. This was part of the move towards producing more powerful steam locomotives in the 1920s. This one was modified, extensively modified at the front end, as we say, by a later engineer in the 1930s, and we've given this one its colour scheme of the 1938 period.
This isn't the malachite green.
No, this is a slightly earlier version of the Southern Green. Some people still call this version malachite. It's an even brighter green than Cheltenham's.
This is another from your museum, the National Railway Museum,
Yes.
isn't it? Which you've just actually really got tidied up.
Yes, this is another one of the National Collection, but as with the Johnson Spinner, this is one that's at the moment on loan to the Steamtown Museum at Carnforth, and it's that organisation that's done the restoration for us.
And now another coming in the lovely Midland livery. Red, I always think of it, but Lake, I think, is the name everyone uses. Leander.
Yes, the LMS adopted Midland Lake, as we call it, as its colour scheme for its more important express engines, and here's one of them from the 30s, designed by William Stanier, who came to the LMS from the Great Western Railway, and you've got the tapered boiler, which was very much the feature of Great Western engines too.
Well, Stanier was the great designer of the trains that went up the west coast, wasn't
Yeah, that's right. And this locomotive is coupled to a dynamometer car from our collection at York, which is a testing vehicle used for evaluating locomotive performance. And it's full of equipment and gadgets to enable the coal consumption, water consumption, drawbar pull, and many other technical details. Through the window you can see the very elaborate recording equipment and the rolls of paper on which the traces were made by moving pens as the locomotive was tested.
I must also mention, though, the one behind, which is a griddle car, if I recognise it rightly, the kind they have in Scotland, where you could drink at one end and eat at the other. Now, we've talked of Stanier, the West Coast designer, and we turn to Gresley, the East Coast designer, because this is a Gresley locomotive. Green Arrow.
Yes, this is the first of 3 Gresley engines in this parade. We've seen the Great Western contribution and the Southern contribution. We now have a trio of very famous London and North Eastern locomotives, led off by Green Arrow, a very substantial mixed traffic design, pulling 2 very typical London and North Eastern coaches in the varnished teak, which was an alternative colour decoration to paintwork.
Very beautiful too. Did Gresley design the coaches as well as the locomotives?
Yes, Gresley in fact started his life as a carriage designer, and the second vehicle in this train was one of the very earliest Gresley vehicles ever to be built. It dates from 1908, and you can see from the shape of it that he got a very modern shape as early as that, and it didn't change much for the next 30 years. And it became very much a feature of East Coast trains, especially in your neck of the woods, Brian.
Yeah. Used to stand on the castle at Newcastle as a child. We could look down on that marvellous crossing. See nothing but trains like this going past.
Well, Green Arrow is quite unique in the sense it's the only survivor of its type, and we use it on the main line for excursion work, which is a very popular locomotive and a great favourite with our mechanical engineer at the museum.
And you take the coaches out as well for excursions?
Yes, indeed, from time to time. The leading vehicle was on our centenary catering train only last autumn.
That was when we were celebrating 100 years of eating on railways.
Yes.
Originally by Great Northern Railway in 1922, entered service in the LNER colours in 1923.
Well, now the next one too must be Gresley, is it, or not?
Oh, yes, this must be one of the most famous locomotives in the business. It's Flying Scotsman.
Of course.
Very similar in visual lines to Green Arrow, but an extra pair of wheels at the front. This is a 462, whereas Green Arrow is a 262.
Now, why do you think Flying Scotsman has become so famous?
I think partly because of the racy look of the locomotive. You can feel it going quickly, even though it's only moving quite slowly, because it's such a beautifully graceful design. Also, its name commemorates the 10 o'clock train from King's Cross to Scotland, which has been called the Flying Scotsman for over a century. And this was, of course, a high-speed train, even before the days of the modern railway.
So they named the service, did they, before they named an engine to run the service?
Indeed they did, and this causes great confusion, because there is still a Flying Scotsman train, the 10 o'clock from King's Cross.
It doesn't go non-stop now, though, does it? Doesn't it stop at Newcastle, or did the Flying Scotsman always stop at Newcastle?
The Flying Scotsman started by stopping at several places. It became a non-stop train when the corridor tenders were fitted to this very type of locomotive. In fact, Flying Scotsman has a corridor tender, so that the crew could change partway through the journey by passing through the tender from the carriages. At the back of the tender, there's a sort of corridor connection which enables them to get into the train. You can see it there.
Now this one is unmistakably a Gresley. It not only has the stamp of Gresley, it has his name on it, because this is the Sir Nigel Gresley. I suppose representative of the fastest train in the world.
Yes, the class was the fastest steam locomotive in the world. Mallard, of course, at the Railway Museum at York. This is, in fact, the post-World War II steam record holder, having achieved 112 miles an hour. It's effectively a streamlined version of the Flying Scotsman type, with slight modifications at the cylinders, but essentially it's an engine like Flying Scotsman, but with this glamorous streamlined casing.
Because there are those enthusiasts who don't like the streamlining, who like to see the steam locomotives looking more unmistakably, boilers. But I think I remember when Silver Jubilee, for instance, first went through Newcastle, we were all ecstatic.
Yes, originally, of course, the wheels on this locomotive were covered up by flat metal plates, but at a later stage, the flat metal plates were removed to allow access to the working parts.
Good indication there of the steam age as everything disappeared.
The chime whistle, it was quite unique to these locomotives. Most LNER locomotives had a quite high-pitched whistle, but this beautiful two-tone chime, slightly American in sound, identified itself instantly to enthusiasts down the East Coast main line. When you heard that whistle, you knew what was coming.
Now, there are those, of course, who would say that this actually represents the sort of epitome of the British steam express train, would you?
Yes, this particular class, and one we shall shortly be seeing, certainly represent the high point of British express passenger steam. Its only real rival, I think, is the equivalent Stanier locomotive, the Duchess type, which we shall be seeing very soon.
Also those who would say it clearly indicates why we had a Clean Air Act.
Yes, well, that's a point too.
one, the Cumbria Mountain Express is another, and this summer,
Now this combination is a feast, a famous service, Golden Arrow, a famous locomotive clan line, and the pulling three magnificent Pullman cars.
Yes, this is really quite a collection, isn't it? The locomotive was designed by a man who started life as Gresley's assistant on the LNER, a man called Oliver Bully. It was streamlined when it was originally built, and then later had the streamlined casings removed to reveal underneath a perfectly conventional shaped locomotive. Very popular they became. This one is privately preserved by the Clan Line Association, and the carriages that the train is pulling are a representative collection of Pullmans rather than typical of the Golden Arrow service. This one, for instance, Audrey, is one of the old Brighton Bell cars, and would be normally have been found as one of the carriages in the middle of the Brighton Bell electric trains. The first carriage, Topaz, is from our collection in York, and is
very old, that one.
Yes, 1913, and the sort that used to go down to the south coast from places like Victoria. The figures in the leading compartment are wax dummies in period costume that we normally have on show in the museum.
And Emerald at the back.
Emerald at the back is a very much more modern carriage of a type built as recently as 1960 for use on the East Coast services between London and Yorkshire and London and the North East. In fact, the Tees-Tyne Pullman, I dare say you've travelled on more than once, would have this sort of carriage on it.
Yes, it did, and it had those lovely little lamps with little shades on. I think that's one of the things that people lament the passing of most, isn't it, the Pullman? After all, there's only one left now, the Manchester Pullman, and nowhere else.
Yes, I think the problem is that to get that degree of luxury, you can't put as many seats in the train, and therefore it begins to become a very costly exercise.
It was a private company, wasn't it, Pullman, and then British Rail took it over?
Yes, originally it was an offshoot of its American parent, and then it became a British company, and they owned the vehicles, and the railways collected the fares. The supplement you paid for riding on a Pullman was the only revenue Pullman got apart from the meal prices.
that's the best news of the day so far.
Well, now an opportunity to dwell on one of the great Stanier locomotives from the LMS, Princess Elizabeth.
Yes, this is in effect the LMS answer to the Flying Scotsman type of locomotive. Princess Elizabeth was the second Stanier 462 to be built, and in 1936 put up a non-stop record run from London to Glasgow in record time, and came back the following day even faster. And
were Stanier and Gresley great rivals, or great friends in their rivalry?
I said they were rivals in the sense that their railways were in competition, and the enthusiast, of course, has perpetuated this rivalry, but they were in fact close personal friends.